Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of our symposium, Reading Modes Today. We're excited to start with the first panel today, What Kind of Reader Is This? Where we're going to talk about affect, embodiment, sexual difference, and typification as they relate to the reading process. Hopefully, there will be some tears. We will have three speakers. Each will talk for 20 minutes, and then we will have enough time for discussion. So, as I also recommended yesterday, really keep notes of what you want to ask, and hopefully we'll have a vivid conversation. So first, we'll be talking Lizel Yamaguchi from the Department of French here at UC Berkeley. Then we will move to Emma Lieber of the Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts at the New School and an analyst at the National Psychological Association for Psychoanalysis. And we will end with Dora Zhang from the Department of Comparative Literature and English at UC Berkeley. Lizel, take us off.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Good. Okay. Thank you all for being here for the first panel of the day. I have a handout that hopefully is in all of your hands, or at least in proximal hands. So what I've prepared to contribute to our conversation on close reading is not a methodological intervention, nor a methodological injunction. It's also not a metacritical reflection on practice. This gave me a lot of anxiety last night as I was preparing to come, because those seem to be our dominant modes of presenting. What I've prepared is really practice itself in public of the very early stages of a project on the relationship of the body to verse. So I've picked out the bit that seems to me to elaborate, sort of despite itself, a historical theory of affectivity in reading that Verlaine would be furious to call a theory, and certainly would not have used the word affectivity. But it's a historical account, in a way, of the literary experience. So I think, or I hope, will intersect in stimulating ways with the contemporary methodological reflections that have been on offer. And I would relate it to our title just to say that it's close, distant, embodied artificial modes of reading in another time. So not today, that maybe that could be helpful or stimulating or enlightening. So reduced to tears. If we take him at his word, Paul Verlaine cried a lot. He was entirely unapologetic about it. In response to an 1891 query that bore on the definition of symbolism, for example, Verlaine replied dismissively, "I couldn't care less. When I'm suffering, when I'm overjoyed, when I break down in tears, I am sure there's nothing symbolic about it. I do not feel any impulse that would oblige me to seek out the reason for my tears." So Verlaine rejects any affiliation with symbolism on the grounds of the term's abstraction. Symbols presenting something other than what they ostensibly are. A poetry that traffics in symbols could only ever operate at an unwelcome remove from the intensity of emotion that Verlaine seeks. Elation, grief, despair, these do not manifest themselves in symbols, but in somatic response. Poetry, accordingly, should be conceived in terms of feeling, not symbolizing. So in this aesthetic hierarchy that places abstract analysis at its nadir, tears well up at the apex, offering irrefutable evidence of affective response. So it's hardly a secret that in Verlaine's conception, poetry's raison d'être is the inscription, the intensification, and communication of feeling. Verse for him is a means of feeling more, of capturing a feeling, of feeling it again, feeling it more devastatingly, cathartically, overwhelmingly. And verse is also a means, crucially, I think, of sharing that feeling, of making feeling communicable. As readers from François Copé to Arnaud Bernardet have observed, the role of sound is exceptionally prominent in such verse. So the sort of critical commonplace is that, Verlaine is the poet of sound, and he kind of couldn't care less what he's actually saying, that as long as it sounds good, it's good enough for Verlaine. So this is well established that sound rivals and often outshines sense in its ability to evoke and intensify emotion. But the sonic accomplishment's close association with bodily response, and particularly with tears, has gone uncommented. So given the prevalence and prominence of crying in Verlaine, it's somewhat surprising that the leitmotif has been so entirely absent from scholarly attention. So we could recall, for example, even those not in French studies have probably had a glimpse of Il pleure dans mon cœur, it's weeping in my heart, that French children still learn in school, whose four quatrains join the rhythm of the rain to the pain of the lyric subject, whose query, quelle est cette langueur qui pénètre mon cœur, right? So what is this languor that pierces my heart? Would seem to ask precisely what Verlaine claims not to, right? The logic or the reason for my tears. We could talk about Les Deux Pleureuses, the two weeping women of Romance sans parole, romances without words, or the tolling of the hour in Chanson d'automne, another sort of blockbuster that Anglophone readers might be familiar with, which prompts the poet to dissolve into tears as well. So tout suffocant et blâme quand sonne l'heure, je me souviens des jours anciens et je pleure. So Verlaine's thematization of crying extends all the way back to the first poem he saw fit to print, Parisian Nocturne, Nocturne Parisien, that you have on your handout at great length, which he composed in the winter of 1861 at the age of 17. So ostensibly a reflection on the comparative shortcomings of the River Seine, the text reaches its climax when a barrel organ suddenly blasts refrains of garish street music across the Parisian waterway. And I would just note that one of my delights in this really quite grating poem is that this is an experience that we all still have. The garish street music continues to blast across the Seine. Nothing has changed. So I'm going to read the text in French because the sounds are important, and I've provided for you a translation that I've noted as adapted from Kevin Kirschway. So this is so unpopular a poem of Verlaine's that there's actually only one translation into English. Stunning. There's only one, and it came out in 2011. And I have used Kevin Kirschway's translation as the basis, but I have shamelessly modified it to such a degree that you should certainly hold me accountable for all of the scandalous things that you see in the translation, of which there will be many. So, et puis, tout à coup, ainsi qu'un ténor effaré, lançant dans l'air bruni son cri désespéré, son cri qui se lamente et se prolonge et crie, éclate en quelques coins l'orgue de barbarie. Il prend ses airs, romances ou polkas, qu'enfin nous tapotions sur nos harmonicas, et qui font long ou vif, réjouissance du triste, vibrer l'âme aux proscrits, aux femmes, aux artistes. C'est écorché, c'est faux, c'est horrible, c'est dur, et donnerait la fièvre Rossini pour sûr. Ses rires sont traînés, ses plaintes sont hachées, sur une clé de sol impossible à juger. Les notes ont un rhume et les dos sont des las, mais qu'importe, l'on pleure en entendant cela. So, characterized primarily by its harsh timbres and haphazard performance, the song that is being played here is indeterminate, right? So it's one of these tunes, some anthem or ditty, un de ces airs, romance ou polka, and it's simplistic, right? So that we've tapped out on xylophones when itty-bitty. It's of decidedly low cultural standing. It would give a Rossini a fever for sure. Unacceptable to refined tastes and trained ears, the music belongs to a class of cultural production to which only the seemingly spurious, weak, and womanly are susceptible. So it comes as something of a shock to read the lyric voice's sudden, apparent confession of a visceral response to the organ's song. And I should mention here that the orgue de barbarie is translated into English as a barrel organ. That is the only real possible translation. But orgue de barbarie is, the organ sort of from the east, barbare, but it's the same root as barbarian, right? So there's in the lexical sort of item in French this evocation of a pre-linguistic or expressivity or a there's none of the abstraction of language that could be heard in this organ of barbarian speech or non-speech. So in one fell swoop, Rossini's ideals of complexity and sonority are dismissed, trumped, it would seem, by the proof of the pudding. But so what? It brings tears to the eyes. And the music's effects don't stop there. So against all expectations, the barrel organ's devastating drone transports the mind into the land of dreams, causing a feeling of sympathy to swell up in the heart. Held in the grip of the organ's song, the lyric subject is literally enthralled, overwhelmed by involuntary emotional and somatic response. Mais l'esprit transporté dans les pays des rêves sont à ces vieux accords coulés en lui des sèves. La pitié monte au cœur et les larmes aux yeux. So there are four key aspects of this passage that seem to me worth stressing. So first, and most obviously, the prompt to tears is music or something in music, something which seems, something that is other than compositional sophistication or virtuosic performance. Second, the somatic response is impersonal, right? So it's not je pleure en entendant cela, mais l'on pleure. One cries hearing this. The impersonal pronoun posits an anyone and an everyone. The claim seems to be that anyone would cry on hearing this music. In fact, everyone would. This leads me to my third observation, which concerns the leveling effect of the outburst, which is set up to nullify the class-coded distinctions of musical quality advanced in the preceding lines. It positions the lyric subject on the side of the popular classes, the feminine, the outcasts, and more generally, really bad taste, while simultaneously retaining an impersonal claim to universality. Right, so it's the spirit, it brings tears to the eyes. La pitié monte au cœur et les larmes aux yeux, etc. And then finally, echoing Jacques Robichet and Steve Murphy, I would underscore the mimetic quality of the verses themselves, whose cacophonous clattering towards a climax suggests an identification of the poem itself with the popular song. So the poem's title, Parisian Nocturne, in other words, comes to refer simultaneously both to the song of the barrel organ and to Verlaine's poem, with both readings drawing our attention to a glaring incompatibility between our expectations of an early 19th century nocturne, think Chopin, and the music that Verlaine's verses call to mind. What the passage obliges us to notice is something in music, even and perhaps especially in bad music, that unilaterally coerces emotional and even physical response and is made manifest paradigmatically in tears. This quality bears a disquieting resemblance to the quality in music that Pascal Quignard discusses at length in his 1996 La haine de la musique, The Hatred of Music. Here he observes that music violates the human body. It makes one stand up. Musical rhythms enthrall bodily rhythms. Music as a power thus joins all forms of power. Hearing and obedience are related. Quignard's observations emerge in the context of a meditation on why German soldiers provided music in the death camps of the Second World War. Quignard concludes that it was to increase the inmates' obedience and to bind them together in an impersonal, non-privative fusion that all music engenders. An impersonal, non-privative fusion that all music engenders. As Anne Smock usefully summarizes in her review of the book's recent English translation, Pascal Quignard is, I dare say, among the lovers of music who love the unmusic in it, which is not captivating, does not make us stand up, clap, chant, march, obey. Music's unmusicalness does not force its way into us and wring love from us. I would hazard the opinion that to Smock's list of actions that music can coerce out of us, stand up, clap, chant, march, obey, one might well add the crying of Verlaine's Parisian Nocturne. And I would further venture to suggest that the value Verlaine places on this powerful and leveling coercive aspect of music accounts in some part for his unpopularity with scholars today. There are plenty of reasons to go around. Smock and Quignard's shared hatred of the coercive element in music participates in an identifiable current running through quite a bit of 21st century poetry criticism. One could cite, for example, Meredith Martin's critique of meter's instrumentalization in the English National Project of Citizen Formation, the metrical march of military exercises. So this is an aspect of poetry that's particularly available for instrumentalization by nationalistic and militaristic pursuits. The core idea shared amongst these critical voices is that there's something coercive and indeed dangerous in music, which metrical poetry shares, and that it is important that those who love poetry be on their guard against it. So I'm probably not doing Verlaine any favors by suggesting that when he famously champions music above all else, de la musique avant toute chose, the music to which he refers might bear some uncomfortable similarities to the music that Pascal Quignard hates. The music championed in Verlaine's Ars Poetica is muted, to be sure, faded, oblique, built of verses counting an odd number of syllables rather than the historically canonized and therefore charged octosyllables, decasyllables, and alexandrines. But just as these verses' seeming lightness can exist only by means of a firm metrical foundation and national memory, so can the music that Verlaine champions achieve its delicate effects only by calling on the peculiar power structures of popular song. It mutes the barrel organ's blare, in other words, only to finesse and intensify its powers of coercion. The disquieting relation is most evident, I think, in the poem's duplicitous discussion of what poets should seek to avoid: cheap, low-class compositional tricks that tellingly bring the heavens to tears. So this is also an art poétique. Fuis du plus loin, la pointe assassine, l'esprit cruel et le rire impur qui font pleurer les yeux de l'azur, et tout c'était de basse cuisine. So the comedy of these lines resides in the glaring contrast between their insincere advice and their instantiation, or if you like, their injunction and their effect. So as Michel Grimaud has observed, the stance's imperative to flee unholy laughter and cruel wit is mimetically accompanied in a self-parodying way by two shockingly incompatible images: the weeping eyes of angels and the garlic of scullery scum. The stanza's third line invokes an elevated metaphor by which the heavens cry rather than rain. And the elevated rhetoric serves to heighten our surprise that what has caused the skies to cry might be garlic. With cruel wit and cutting laughter, the juxtaposition also repeats the very Verlainian association of crying with bad taste, susceptibility to bad taste. And here, as in the Parisian Nocturne of 1861, the lofty are brought low by the leveling of tears, which bear witness to a certain universal susceptibility to sensory stimulation. So I suggested earlier that the coercive quality in music that Pascal Quignard hates, that unifying rhythm that makes us tap or clap or march, is precisely the quality that Verlaine values, and that this conflict of values might account in part for Verlaine's unpopularity today. And by way of conclusion, I would add that Verlaine's adamant defense of meter and rhyme, in short, versificatory structure, is in my reading motivated by his sense that only metrical poetry shares with music this crucial unifying quality, which he perceives to be threatened both by the unfeeling academicism of the early Parnassians and the meterless lines of the vers-libristes that follow. So consider, if you will, the prologue to poem Saturnien of 1866, where Verlaine lays out his project for poetry. The poem is an unapologetic ode to verse's violent side, the battle cry, the march, poetry in the service of war, from the Bhagavad Gita to the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Chanson de Roland. Poetry and war, the text recalls, used to go hand in hand. Est-ce que le trouvère héroïque n'eut pas, comme le preux sa part auguste des combats? Didn't the heroic trouvère, did he not, like the valiant knight, have his distinguished share in combat? Yet today, the lyric voice laments. Acting and dreaming have split. Aujourd'hui, l'action et le rêve ont brisé le pacte primitif par les siècles usés, et plusieurs ont trouvé funeste ce divorce de l'harmonie immense et bleue et de la force. La force qu'autrefois le poète tenait, en bride le blanc cheval ailé qui rayonnait. So the horse, a classic figure for meter, is the force that poets have allowed to escape their grip, having unclipped their eloquence from the reins of power. They have relinquished force and action in favor of dreams. The result is a divided humanity in which, far from the uproar of life and the undisciplined shock of mercenary war, poets stand apart, beautiful, pure, with beaming eyes, exiled from a violent world that they are happy to exile from their verse. So Steve Murphy has recently read these lines as evidence of Verlaine's political engagement, citing his alliance of poetry and violence in the name of the French Republic as counter-evidence to his reputation as an apolitical art for art's sake Parnassian. My own reading tends to locate the significance of the prologue in the unifying vision that it advances in the final stanza, a vision that would unite dreams and action, poets and people. Meter plays a crucial role in this connection. Figured as the winged horse, it is or was the poet's force, and it is surely no accident that the force of the very word placed at the rhyme derives from the metrical structure from which it is notably not divorced. In the tension of the reins between the poet and meter, if the tension in the reins between the poet and meter is what gives poetry its force, it's worth noting that the tension runs both ways. The poet is also the one who keeps the winged horse in check. Once the reins have been relinquished, the horse is transformed into a purely violent and destructive beast. La force, maintenant, la force, c'est la bête. Féroce, bondissante, et folle, et toujours prête à tout carnage, à tout dévastement, à tout égorgement, etc. So the role of the poet, as the early Verlaine envisions it, is both an influential one and a public one. Conscious of his paramilitary power, the poet can hold the reins of the volatile feelings of the crowd, pushing them to war or to sing the praises of the Republic. This judicious manipulation of the common measure finds its closing figuration significantly, I think, in a voice that cries or laughs, just when one laughs or cries. La voix qui rit pleure alors qu'on pleure ou rit. It's a voice that coincides bodily, in other words, with the feelings of the public. Thank you.
So thanks again so much for inviting me. I'm having a really great time. This is a lot of fun. So the title of my talk is Reading and Sexual Difference Again. The again is a reference to Lacan's Seminar 20 Encore in which he develops his ideas about sexuation, which I'll be saying a bit more about. And we can hear in the cours of Encore something of the body. And I'm speaking both as a literary scholar and teacher and as a Lacanian psychoanalyst. And some of what I'll be speaking about is taken from a forthcoming book. As a Lacanian psychoanalyst, I'm used to being in rooms where Lacan's idea that, quote, the sexual relation does not exist or is impossible is taken as a truism, and in which the concept of sexual difference is perhaps problematically in need of no definition, precisely because it makes definitiveness or an end to knowledge impossible. That is, sexual difference castrates knowledge. But it does mean that we tend to throw around the term without checking the room first. So as a way of checking the room, I'll just offer from the outset that in a certain Lacanian mode, sexual difference stands for the whole in meaning that makes something like reading possible. Reading, that is, as an activity that engages with the slippages of signifiers. At the same time, the terminology inevitably locates this radical epistemological vortex originally in the body. I'll go on to say a bit more about the way in which the non-relation between signifier and signified in Saussure's terminology, the extent to which they have nothing essential to do with each other, is not just a homology for, but also the cause of the particular strangeness of human sexual constitution, where nothing anchors our drives to our objects in any essential way. This is one way of understanding the idea that the sexual relation does not exist. In other words, sexual difference names the way in which epistemology, and particularly the whole in knowledge, is knotted with the body, which we have known, of course, since Freud's ideas about the anatomical distinction between the sexes, or infantile sexual research, or even the dream navel, a way of naming the whole in meaning that is also a somatic figure. At the same time, sexual difference is also a political question, that is, a question of how bodies relate to each other, which is where I'll begin. So my opening premise is that in America today, reading and sexual difference are both in crisis. I don't need to rehearse for this crowd the number of articles published in the last several years bemoaning the state of reading among contemporary students, whether it's high school students who have never read a book cover to cover, having been assigned excerpts instead, or college English majors who can't make heads or tails of the opening paragraph of Bleak House, a book that I assigned for 10 years until I finally took it off my syllabus this semester. We certainly can't blame the students. A few months ago, I read an article saying that the Chicago Sun-Times had accidentally posted a summer reading list generated by AI and populated with non-existent books. Beyond the absurdity of a news organization not fact-checking what it puts out there, what kind of attitude toward the written word does this lapse communicate? What is the cultural status of the book here? When 2 semesters ago, a first-year student came up to me after the first class of my What is Fantasy course, holding the syllabus open, baffled to the list of texts that I had made clear students had to get for themselves, how do I get them? Online? Her confusion was symptomatic of an entire cultural apparatus that had apparently lost, or better to say, suppressed, all sense of what books are and what they're good for. And you'll notice that I have a perhaps sort of phantasmatic overinvestment in the book as a site of reading. One can, as much as one can interrogate what reading is, one can and should interrogate what a book is. For me, I think a book is a body, frankly, which is for me the other site of reading that I'm particularly interested in. At the same time, sexual difference is making the news, having become one of the most explosive issues of the political moment. As Noelle McAfee writes, quote, authoritarianism occurs in a world in which there is no longer any agreed upon authority, end quote. It is the result of the falling away of previous epistemological assurances, what depletes the lost or missing guarantee. She points out as well that one of the characteristics of authoritarianism, along with the suppression of thought, the consolidation of executive power, the normalization of state violence, and other depredations, is a fixation on sexuality. As Elizabeth Weed writes, quote, not only did Viktor Orban banish well-established gender studies programs as part of his project to weaken Hungarian democracy, but also Vladimir Putin regularly evokes gender nonconformity as fundamental to the corrosive Western influences that the war in Ukraine aims to abolish, end quote. What other way can we have of understanding this, besides that authoritarianism is a backlash to an increasing cultural awareness in the contemporary era, aided by the contributions of feminism, queer theory, gender theory, psychoanalysis, and other developments, that the sexual relation, that guarantee of guarantees, does not exist? What other way can we have of understanding Trump's obsession with gender and with who uses which bathroom? That we have finally started to know that no one knows what a woman is has created a definitional frenzy. Lock it down at any cost. The memosphere is further exploding with arguments about which one is the problem today. The feminization of culture, as in the recent article by Helen Andrews, The Great Feminization, which argues that the influx of women into the law and other fields has led to a kind of feminine abjection of their core values, or its masculinization, as is argued by many of her respondents, who point out that obviously the problem at the moment is toxic masculinity. To Weed, the crises in these two realms of gender and reading are connected, and I realize that I'm conflating gender, sexuality, sexual difference, what I'll go on to talk about as sexuation, which all can and should be distinguished, but at the moment I'm claiming them all as equally politically contested precisely because they point to a certain castration of knowledge, which is something that we're having a lot of trouble with right now. As Weed writes, in domestic politics, gender is the site of much anxiety, with nonconformity taken as the need or pretext for the banning of books and the suppression of once accepted educational curricula. The widening of possibilities in representing gender and sexuality has led to a crackdown in reading. But the danger of reading is not only in the content of the books at issue, as though if we can just cordon off a certain subject matter, we'll be safe again. And the linkage between the crisis in sexual difference, or better to say, the suppression of the crisis of sexual difference, in other words, what's happening now is a denial of the trauma of sexual difference as such. The linkage between that suppression and the suppression of reading also obtains on the level of form. Freud's insight that the sexual aim and the sexual object are, quote, merely soldered together, is genetically linked to Saussure's insight that the signifier and the signified are merely soldered together, and to Lacan's elaborations of the implications of this for both psychic and social life. That is, the polymorphousness of embodied life is an effect of the action of the signifier, and presumably, the more educated one becomes in the latter, the more comfortable one becomes with the former. That is, reading is de facto an education in sexual difference and its trauma. This, most broadly, is the inherent precept of psychoanalysis. Indeed, at the same time that psychoanalysis invented the possibility of reading one's unconscious and of reading the body as text, it also intervened on reading as a practice. As Shoshana Fellman writes, quote, "The history of reading has accustomed us to the assumption, usually unquestioned, that reading is finding meaning, that interpretation can dwell only on the meaningful." Lacan's analysis of the signifier opens up a radically new assumption, an assumption that is an insightful, logical, and methodological consequence of Freud's discovery, that what can be read, and perhaps what should be read, is not just meaning, but the lack of meaning. That significance lies not just in consciousness, but specifically in its disruption. That the signifier can be analyzed in its effects without its signified being known, and that the lack of meaning, the discontinuity in conscious understanding, can and should be interpreted as such, without necessarily being transformed into meaning, end quote. So the first text that I tend to assign in my psychoanalysis and literature courses is a personal essay by Donald Antrim called I Bought a Bed, which details the author's repeated attempts and repeated failures to buy a bed in the wake of his mother's death. It's an extremely psychoanalytic text in the sense that it describes a symptom, which itself testifies to many forms of so-called meaning or theoretical construction. The Oedipus complex, the incest taboo, the repetition compulsion, intergenerational trauma, eros, the death drive, the son's guilt, the search for home. My students have a heyday with all of it. I present the essay as a specimen that can educate us in a psychoanalytic reading practice that is also, to my mind, a reading practice proper. That is, a practice that orients itself to the signifier and thus to the lack in meaning as much as to meaning itself. Thus, my task is to present to the students something of the action of the signifier as it makes its presence felt in the piece, and specifically the signifier as divorced from its signified, and as it takes its place in psychic formation as pure acoustic effect without any essential meaning attached. This isn't to say that we don't also read for meaning, right? But we're reading for something that also simultaneously undercuts or undoes meaning. Because at the center of the essay, at the center of Antrim's symptom of being unable to buy a bed after his mother's death, is the gaping void of a meaningless rhyme, mattress, matricide. the nonsense of oral resonance that creates the speaking subject and any writing it produces. In other words, the symptom is formed not because there is any meaningful connection between a bed and one's mother's death, even though one can find plenty of those after the fact, the deathbed, the sick bed, which Antrim does in this essay, which is brilliant. Forget it was published in the New Yorker in the 90s, maybe. It's really amazing. But simply as an effect of the signifier. This is what underlies and perhaps even undercuts whatever forms of meaning the essay conveys. This is what creates a symptom, and this is what, after psychoanalysis, it means to read. I also, in connection with this essay, I sometimes teach a very neat dream that a patient of mine had that hinged on walking into a room and seeing her mother and her sister doing PCP together. And, you know, we like paused over the dream a bit, but she couldn't really make anything of the PCP and, you know, or of any of it really. And so we let it go and continue on with the session. And then much later in the session, in some other context altogether, she uses the word preoccupied. And you can hear, I mean, if you're listening as any reader, poetically, you don't have to be listening to an analyst, you can hear the PCP in preoccupied, which allowed the, you know, a fairly standard kind of genetic construction, something about her mother's preoccupation at the time of the birth of her sister when she was, you know, 3 or whatever. But it's also, you know, something of this PCP, and I use this PCP as sort of as a way of teaching something of how dreams work and also something of how texts work and how signification works, because the PCP, as an acronym, also stands for primary care physician, which then marks the dream as a transference dream, and as acronym marks that moment of the PCP as the sort of navel of the dream. That is, as the place at which, just like the chemical formula for trimethylamine in Freud's dream of Irma's injection, sort of marks the place of the place at which the dream, what is represented is the fact of representation itself, and thus interpretation can't plumb that place. It's sort of, it has to stop, and or it goes on forever. So there's an interesting question, and I think important question to ask is like, what does it mean for reading if we keep always in mind Freud's idea of the dream navel as the place where interpretation is interminable, let's say. Paula Hochman further makes dual claims about reading as it relates to psychoanalysis. That, on the one hand, quote, to read is to experience rootlessness in the face of something greater, that is, the elucubrations of language, a field the reader inhabits and which exceeds him, pre-exists him, end quote. And on the other, to the extent that, quote, reading also comes from the Latin legere, which means to choose, reading is the opposite of submission, end quote. I mean, I think this actually ties back interestingly to a kind of latent conversation that was going on yesterday about the question of whether reading is active or passive. What goes in which direction when we read? Does the text come at us? Do we come at the text? Are we asleep? Are we awake? To think about reading with psychoanalysis in mind is to think about how reading constitutes both a radically self-displacing encounter with the big other and a way out of the roles and scenes into which one has been scripted. In other words, reading is both an education in uncontrol, a way of learning to tolerate what psychoanalysis calls castration, which also means to tolerate the lack in meaning, the gap between signifier and signified, and a means by which we might learn to live and take responsibility for our own lives. If we refuse to read, if we are too wedded to the suturings of signifiers and signifieds, if we are too stuck on meaning, which also in this context means being too stuck on a fantasy of the sexual relation as existing, then we also insist on remaining characters in a text written by others, which is how you come into analysis, right? You come in as a character having been written by your parents, by your culture. Thus, it is not just the reading of children's books about gay marriages or trans characters, for example, that is under attack, but reading itself, reading as a radical act that implies other radical possibilities, among them the possibility for self-authorship that is offered by a reading practice like psychoanalysis. We might remember that Lacan's ideas about the self-authorization that obtains at the end of an analysis, his idea that at the end of an analysis, we realize that no governing body or form of authority or primal signifier will authorize our subjectivities, but that we must each authorize ourselves in our own singular way, that this also extended to what he called one's sexuation. That is, the long process of reading oneself in analysis is meant, among other things, to allow one to author oneself into a sexuated position that is by no means a given. I'll say more about sexuation below. But part of what's important here is that the attack on reading and the attack on bodies that we are currently witnessing is also an effect of the inroads that both have made in culture in recent years. That is, that we have come to know something about the contingencies and determinations of bodily life is itself evidence of what good readers we had become. Indeed, it almost seems that as a culture, we had become too good at reading, too sensitive to the ethics of representation, too aware of the ways in which the vagaries of signification are bound up in our bodily lives. As a result, our defenses were inflamed, and Trump stepped in right where we asked for him. This all then is likely related to the extent to which psychoanalysis, which as an education in both the signifier and sexuality and in their imbrication, has over the past several years evidently made a comeback. Matching the number of articles about attacks on reading and on trans people recently have been articles from publications like The Chronicle to the New York Times style section of all places about the resurgence of psychoanalysis among young intellectuals and trendsetters. Given that authoritarianism has never exactly smiled on psychoanalysis, one can only imagine what's coming. 30 years ago in What Does a Woman Want? Reading and Sexual Difference, Fellman asked what it might mean, quote, for a woman to reclaim, reread, rewrite, appropriate Freud's question, that is, what does a woman want? And thus whether, quote, it is in the power of this question to engender, through the literary or the psychoanalytic work, a woman's voice as its speaking subject, end quote. I think it is high time that we return to these questions from the vantage point of the current cultural moment, in which it has become both less clear and more contested than ever to which bodies this woman's voice might belong. In my remaining time, I'd like to elaborate some of the ideas, just some, contained in Lacan's formulas of sexuation, which he developed largely in his seminar Encore, his 20th seminar on feminine sexuality. These formulas which are, I mean, if you've seen them, I wanted to have them up. It's this crazy table this is how Lacan expressed himself often, these like sort of crazy mathematical graphics that you can work on and work on and work on and work on for basically your entire life, which is like what I'm doing. And I don't know if I'm wasting my life on this, but these formulas aim to represent what Lacan calls sexuation, an epiphenomenon of sexual difference by way of a set of quasi-mathematical and logical formulas. And I'll discuss them, these ideas, as they both open up a certain trans epistemology and as they relate to questions of reading. And I'm not going to distinguish the various graphical terms or in any detailed way, but I just want to sort of attempt to discuss in broad strokes some of the ideas that the formulas try to telegraph. So the fundaments of the formulas have been rehearsed frequently enough in Lacanian circles. What Lacan calls masculine logic, as encapsulated in Freud's myth of the primal father, posits a figure who is spared castration. That is, a founder who is self-identical, undivided by the unconscious, unalienated by and within language, uncleaved by lack. In a sense, the primal father is the mythic incarnation of one who is not subjected to the split or bar between the signifier and the signified, that which Lacan identified as the origin of the unconscious. He is one for whom the two match up in a suffusion of meaning, and thus for whom sexual difference as such does not obtain. For the primal father, the sexual relation exists. This is a mythic figure who is imagined as a result to be capable of full satisfaction, complete jouissance, and the completedness of meaning here being aligned, and one whose status remains an ever-present possibility, as though one could become the master one has posited as one's forebear. It is what Trump performs, a figure of obscene enjoyment to whose status we can only aspire. This exception to the law of castration also legislates a kind of assumptive community. Masculine logic makes men into a band of brothers united around their shared fantasy of unencumbered manhood, and universality is constituted by virtue of a model whose status as exception creates a border that allows for a closed set of men. Feminine logic and fantasy structure, on the other hand, know well that all speaking subjects are subject to castration, which means that all speakers have an unconscious, that we are all privy to the very trauma of sexual difference that the formulas represent. That is, for a feminine subject, who is defined logically in this way, not biologically, there is no exception to the rule of castration. The big other is lacking. The signifier and the signified will never align, which also means that signification is interminable. There is neither a primal nor a final term in a genealogical series, no firm origin or endpoint to the displacements of signification. Thus, if in masculine logic there is, let's say, both a first and a potential final term in a series, an endpoint, a fantasied endpoint to both knowledge and signification, where one might finally coincide with oneself, feminine logic refuses that fantasy. You can hear that the feminine position is a privileged one here. Correspondingly, the feminine formula presents women as an open set. Absent the exception that creates a border around a fantasied community, there is nothing to legislate one's adherence to a group identification. No model of femininity against which to regulate oneself, nothing to tell anyone how to be a woman. In this sense, what women bring to sexual difference are singularity and radical difference themselves, as well as a logic of one by one. There is no way to determine where their collection starts or stops, as each woman must authorize themselves as a woman in their own way. At the same time that what a woman is here becomes, rather than anything pre-given, defined by this very singular act of self-authorization. And in other words, anyone who, no matter their biology, has relinquished any fantasies of perfect self-consistency and universality, thereby becomes their own, determines their own singular way of living, is by definition a woman. You can hear here a kind of trans logic, not only in that any subject can locate themselves according to either logic or fantasy structure, masculine or feminine, but also in the implication that there is no collective consensus on which to base a definition of femininity. Importantly, this form of self-authorization, that is, a self-authorization that is founded on an acceptance of castration, is something that Lacan associates with the end of analysis. In a way, the procedure of psychoanalysis aims at a certain feminization of the subject, at the creation of the subject as woman. What I want to underline here is that if femininity and feminine sexuality are identified, among other things, as an acceptance of the bar between signifier and signified, of the gap in meaning, and hence of the unending play of signification that makes up life as a speaking subject, then the becoming woman that Lacan urges as the aim of analysis is also a becoming reader. That is, a reader as one who is sensitive to the unending play of signification, who refuses to rest on a fantasy of a final word, who understands that difference will never be eradicated, and who thereby becomes the author of their own lives. To undergo an analysis is to become a woman reader, or rather a woman/reader, a process that we need to support now more than ever.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Yael first for organizing this event, and Stephen, Michaela, Rebecca, everyone at the Townsend Center. My talk is called kind of vaguely on generalizing I've just started to give very vague titles because I never quite know what I'm going to end up talking about. So if you're vague enough, you can cover all your bases. And so this is going to be, the relationship between the particular and the general is going to be really my theme. And so I'm going to start off with some very general, kind of more metacritical comments, and then move into something a little more particular. In the preface to Narrative Discourse, a foundational work of narrative theory, Gerard Genette acknowledges the paradoxical nature of his method. While aiming to be a systematic theory of narrative as such, it is at the same time an extremely close reading of a single work, Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, a work, moreover, that it treats as at once exemplary and exceptional. This is, Genette concludes, and I'm quoting, the paradox of every poetics, and doubtless of every other activity of knowledge as well, always torn between those two unavoidable commonplaces, that there are no objects except particular ones, and no science except of the general, end quote. The predicament Genette describes, which he frames also as a tension between theory and criticism, by no means originates with him. Although among all the subfields of literary studies, narratology is probably the one most committed to pure theory. But it is a predicament that we're unlikely to hear today. Except for a few notable holdouts, we in the literary humanities are far from an age where we understand what we do to be a science of the general. Indeed, the very term, the aspiration, may seem hopelessly naive. To be sure, the classifying, synthesizing, systematizing, typologizing ambitions of the mid-20th century that we see, for instance, in the work of Auerbach and Northrop Frye, Mimesis and Anatomy of Criticism were published within a few years of each other, as well as the structuralist monuments of the 1960s. Those energies are inherited in different ways by latter-day narratology, Marxist critics still aiming at totality, and perhaps more recently computational literary studies. But surveying the literary humanities today, it seems to me, broadly speaking, that we tend to value the granularity of the particular and its cognates, such as the local, over the broad sweep of the general. One way to historicize the rise of particularity as an epistemic virtue in the literary humanities is to point to the confluence of multiple intellectual and political forces in the latter half of the 20th century, directed at puncturing grand narratives of history and unveiling false universalisms of the subject or the human. So I'm thinking, of course, of the influence of post-structuralism, deconstruction, the discursive analyses of Foucault, postmodern theorists like Lyotard, and particularly in English departments, the thick contextualism of new historicism and its resistance to the abstract, the general, and the theoretical in favor of, quote, the singular, the specific, and the individual. It's from Kathy Gallagher and Stephen Greenblatt's Practicing New Historicism. This emphasis on particulars as not easily induced into abstract general theories in the later 20th century went hand in hand with the elevation of concepts of difference. I think there's some resonances with what we just heard. Here, we can add to the strains of continental theory the influence of the radical social movements of the 1960s and 70s in the US, which led to the establishment of departments of African American studies, ethnic studies, women and gender studies, among others, as well as identity-based fields of literary study in English departments. Meanwhile, this is a very partial history, obviously, that I'm giving here, but meanwhile, post-colonial theory, often in dialogue with post-structuralism and deconstruction, showed the constitutive others at the core of Western modernity via attention to local and regional contexts beyond Europe. All of these different intellectual strands have taught us to be wary of generalizations whose smooth surfaces and extensive reach often cover over imbalances of power and histories of violence. And yet, if we move from the level of epistemic virtues to the level of actual practice, we do, of course, generalize all the time. One sense of the term, per the OED, is just to, quote, form general concepts or notions by abstraction from particular instances. It's an indispensable part of cognitive work. And we do this every time we move from an observation about a passage in a novel or a line in a poem to a larger claim about the work as a whole. Or again, when we move from a claim about a single work to a claim about an aesthetic movement, a historical period, or a genre. To generalize is to extend, to convert, this is again the OED, an idea, perception, etc., into a general concept or rule, or to broaden the application of a concept or a rule. The move is at once lateral, extending from one object to another like object, and scalar, converting observations about a singular case into a rule capable of covering many instances. In their practical guidebook, Close Reading for the 21st Century, which has been invoked already many times yesterday, Dan Sinekin and Johanna Wynant make the scalar move explicit. They decompose close reading into 5 steps: scene setting, noticing, local claiming, regional argumentation, and global theorizing. Those are their terms. The spatial metaphors are, and I'm quoting them, partly descriptions of scale and reach. Local, regional, and global describe the deliberate extension from the particular to the abstract, end quote. That extension or scaling up, that step that Wynant and Sinekin call, especially the step that Wynant and Sinekin call global theorizing, where the reading that develops from a textual detail is connected, quoting them again, to the author's body of work, the text genre, form, or period, or historical context, end quote, is what we usually mean when we ask about an argument's stakes. When and how we move from the particular instance to the general claim is crucial to the kind of arguments we make and their perceived legitimacy or convincingness. But we're not always self-conscious or explicit about that move, and certain scales of generalization have become so routine as to require no justification at all. It's not clear, for instance, that in-depth studies of select works by 3 or 4 authors constitute enough evidence to warrant a claim about a period or a movement. But an entire industry of monographs, I'm describing my own book here, proceeds as if it does. In a 2019 brief for a, quote, medial humanities, Paul Santamore observes that when it comes to scales of literary analysis, quote, the middle is the scale that dare not speak its name. This is not because it's taboo or untraversable, but because what it means to work at middle scales is so self-evident as to require no elaboration, end quote. So as an example, we might think here of Eric Hayo's polemic in On Literary Worlds against periodization as the default horizon of an argument, or the unthinking ways in which, I'm quoting Hayo, a strong unstated theory of era has become the final goal and subtending force of the intimacies of literary criticism, which he argues, reifies an idea of a period as a social whole. What would happen, Santamore asks, if, and I'm quoting, instead of continuing unselfconsciously to work at the scalar interface between abstract theorizing and individual case studies, we called that work mesoanalysis, end quote. So I'm not embracing this term, but in this vein, my goal here is just to examine some of the ways we generalize today. What are our default or unspoken ways of connecting the micro to the macro? What are both the perils and affordances of generalization? So in the remainder of this talk, I want to turn to a particular case, the question of how we generalize about people, specifically the ways in which we generalize from individuals to groups. So this inquiry is part of my book project on being a type, which examines what it means to understand individuals, both fictional and real, as representative of larger classes of persons. And although the dynamic interrelationship of singularity and exemplarity is at work in literary representation more generally, it's especially central to the problem of character. Beginning with Aristotle's famous distinction in the Poetics between history and poetry, on the grounds that whereas history tells of particulars, that is, what has actually happened, poetry tells of universals. by which he means what kind of thing a certain kind of person will say or do in accordance with probability or necessity, end quote. As the classicist and one of Aristotle's translators, Leon Golden, explicates, normally we think of characterization as the art of particularizing. Aristotle's emphasis is on the generalizing effect of characterization. To characterize is to assign type traits to an agent. When Medea is characterized, for example, she's given traits appropriate to women in general and to a jealous wife in particular, end quote. Henry Fielding invokes this Aristotelian tradition when, at the outset of the English novel in the early 18th century, he avows, I quote, "I describe not an individual, but a species." As Kathy Gallagher has influentially argued, Fielding's claims serve to protect himself from the charge of libel and to distinguish his work from contemporaneous scandalous tales that were thinly veiled satires of actual people, right? So this gives some plausible deniability if what you're describing is not an individual, but a species. What distinguished, and I'm quoting Gallagher, the new writers from libelers was the insistence that the human referent of the text was a generalization about and not an extratextual embodied instance of a species, end quote. That is, the novel's referential claim, its stake in the real world, pertained not to any existing individual, any existing person, to any real person, but to a class of persons, a species, a type. The novel is thus true in its generality, even though all of its particulars are merely imaginary. That was Gallagher. In a different influential tradition of novel theory, the Marxist aesthetic philosopher Georg Lukács extols the type, the central category of the realist novel, as, quote, "a peculiar synthesis which organically binds together the general and the particular, in both characters and situations," end quote. So in the work of the great 19th century realists, for him, Balzac and Tolstoy, the individual is never merely a particular case, but always embodies the essential contradictions of a historical conjuncture. And through the synthesis and integration of typicality, literature can knit back together the dimensions of public and private sundered by capitalism so that, quote, "every action, thought, and emotion of human beings is inseparably bound up with the life and struggles of the community," end quote. Importantly, for Lukács, a type does not mean an average, which he describes as dead or lifeless. It also does not mean making the individual a case or an example of what he calls an abstract universal. Rather, typicality is derived through a process of intensification, distilling, and depicting the patterns of experience arising from historical processes through the mediations of narrative form. As Yoon Sun Lee glosses in her essay Type, Totality, and the Realism of Asian American Literature, possessed of a living probability, the Lukácsian type has and I quote, "a social, though not purely empirical generality," end quote. So I find myself really drawn to this kind of utopian aspect of Lukács' theory of typicality, his account of what it can do in this kind of integrative, this synthesizing work that it can accomplish. That in my larger project, I'm interested in asking about its fate in post-war and contemporary literature. If the dialectical relationship of the general and the particular is at the heart of the novel, and if typicality is what allows an individual to connect to something outside herself, what happens when the pressures of typification, generalization, and representativeness for both characters and authors are especially fraught or imposed as a burden, as the case, for instance, in US ethnic literatures? What happens when one's particular being and experience is assumed to be perforce a specific kind of general one? What Fielding declared himself to be doing at the founding of the English novel, that is describing not an individual, but a species, is an assumption that ethnic writers have often chafed at. To take a very canonical example, the massive success of Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, published in 1976 was followed by controversy over its authenticity, that is, its accuracy as a representation of a group. In a 1982 response, Kingston expresses impatience with interviewers and reviewers concerned, quote, about how typical of other Chinese Americans she is. Her book is personal and subjective and singular, she avows. It may even, I'm quoting again Kingston, it may even be one of a kind, unique, exceptional. I am not a sociologist who measures truth by the percentage of times behavior takes place. Why must I represent anyone besides myself? End quote. These pressures have not lessened with the explosion of US multi-ethnic writing since the 1970s under the regime of liberal multiculturalism and more recently the neoliberal commodification of diversity in the literary marketplace. In such a landscape, ethnic writers face a double bind: accede to the role of representative spokesperson and risk essentialism, as well as intragroup dispute is the kind that Kingston faced, or insist on the singularity of their characters and representations and risk bypassing the determinations of history as well as the potential for intragroup solidarity. So to be clear, many writers have managed to steer a path through these thickets. What I'm describing is a kind of cultural logic. 4 decades on from Kingston, Zadie Smith echoes some of these frustrations in a 2019 essay in the New York Review of Books, Fascinated to Presume in Defense of Fiction, which inveighs against what she diagnoses as a new imperative of biographical correspondence between writer and work. This is the idea that, quote, this is Smith, that we can and should write only about people who are fundamentally like us, racially, sexually, genetically, nationally, politically, personally, end quote. In effect, Smith is describing the corollary of the logic of representativeness Kingston resented 4 decades earlier. And she's well aware of the reasons motivating this turn, the fact that some people have been unable to represent themselves or subject to false representations and stereotypes, but nevertheless, she says the idea insults her soul. And that's her phrase. The familiar creative writing dictum, write what you know, Smith laments, has become a warning, stay in your lane. And this principle, she notes further, relies on the assumption that, quote, personal experience is inviolate and non-transferable. She's she's like channeling Joan Scott in the evidence of experience here. It may be displayed carefully to the unlike us, but never truly shared by them. The conclusion of this line of thinking is that, quote, only those who are like us, end quote. So translated into the terms of this paper, I think what Smith points out here are the spheres of generalization that are so unthinking as to hardly register as a generalization. Namely, the seamless induction from individual to group in an identity ascription, the assumption of an absolutely smooth scalar transit that makes it possible to satisfy calls for representation in media by simply plugging in an individual who checks one set of boxes. What is also worth pointing out is that the insistence on the inviolable authority of personal experience, which seems to be on the side of particularity, it is utterly mine, is entirely compatible with the specific form of generalization that is not registered as such. There's a short circuit in this logic of the mediating process involved in abstracting from the individual to the group, which we can see, I think, in its starkest form in the hashtag Own Voices movement in young adult fiction, where the push for diversification and publishing is tied explicitly to the matching of author and content, and where there have been multiple controversies over insufficient correspondence or insensitivity that have led to books being pulled or delayed. So I fear I'm coming dangerously close to denunciations of cancel culture, which I'm emphatically not interested in making. But I do want to end by returning to the question of what generalization might afford. Earlier, I described the double bind facing ethnic writers of accepting or embracing the mantle of kind of unproblematic representation. This is kind of the Own Voices version. Or refusing it in favor of the singular, doubling down on representing no one but oneself, as Kingston puts it. what this double bind actually occludes or makes very difficult, I would argue, without having the time to flesh this out with any examples whatsoever, is what it makes difficult is the reflective process of generalization that Lukács described as typicality, a way of connecting to the individual to larger patterns, not through the simple fact of biographical correspondence, but through the work of historically attentive aesthetic mediation. And in the larger project, I do kind of try to work this out with some recent satires of contemporary publishing, of which Percival Everett's Erasure and R.F. Kuang's Yellowface are probably the most prominent or well-known examples where I think they're depicting this double bind, and I'm not sure that they're actually able to get out of it with their satire. And I think that Erasure is more successful, much more successful than Yellowface in this regard. But anyway, put differently, I think typicality has become very difficult to achieve for ethnic writers in particular, because of the proximity of type to stereotype. So, again, like this would have to be historicized more carefully over the course of the 20th century. Stereotype only really emerges in the 1920s. Like our sense of stereotype only emerges in the 1920s with the political journalist Walter Lippmann. But I think that when you talk about type, it sort of inevitably or seems to slip very easily into stereotype, and there's a kind of conflation between the two. And this is also drawing on my experience of undergraduate teaching, where identifying stereotypes I find is often the first or default critical move that students come into the classroom with, and where its antidote appears to be the freedom of total individuality, right? That is the freedom to not be any type at all, right? That's the way you refute a stereotype. So my sense is that our awareness emerging from hard-fought battles of the very real dangers of generalizing about groups of people, coupled with long-standing liberal associations of freedom with individual choice, has had the effect of making transcendent particularity seem like the only or default answer to the falsifications of stereotype and its overgeneralizations. But the recourse to particularity as a response to stereotyping obstructs that level of patterns and commonalities, the ways in which we are, for specific historical and social reasons, in fact, a type. And the retreat to the particular, I think, is just the other side of the coin of this unreflective biographical correspondence that's deplored by Smith, which is its own kind of overgeneralization. The non-originality of our experience continually exposes us to the infelicities of stereotype, but the scale of the typical is the one that connects us to something outside of ourselves. How to operate at this scale of a social, though not purely empirical, generality remains an ongoing question for writers and readers seeking to make sense of that basic question of social existence. Who am I and what do I have in common with others? Thanks.
Thank you so much for these very rich talks. Let's open up. Anyone wants to ask?
Laura, that was a lovely paper. First of all, I really enjoyed listening to you. And there's so many things we could discuss, alternatives to the particular and the universal. And I'll just footnote Wittgenstein here, but I will not go on about that. My question is really, or you made me think that when you talk about Lukács and type, what came to my mind very powerfully is Jameson's concept of allegory. I was just rereading, first of all, meta-commentary, and then the piece on allegory in La Cousine Bête, which came out in the PMLA, is it 1780? I mean, they came in two consecutive issues, and the one on allegory in La Cousine Bête is really Jameson trying to say that the characters, the Baron Hulot, Cousine Bette, and all that, aren't really just character. They're like a thickened, congealed amalgam of collective impulses, so that it's more than a type. I mean, obviously, Lukács is there, but that concept I thought was just right up your street, and like may be helpful to integrate into your fascinating analysis.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for such a wonderful panel. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay. My question is for Emma, and it's both actually a point of clarification because I'm not so familiar with psychoanalysis, but also a pedagogical question. So this semester, I am participating in a rather wonderful program we have called Berkeley Connect, where graduate students sort of mentor undergraduates in this broad way. And because I'm doing it through the English department, actually in some ways the entire semester is about why should we read and why should we write. So when I've been meeting students one on one, it's not quite like analysis, but I feel it resembles it. Good. And we've actually been talking about and reading a little bit about bibliotherapy and its ancient roots and stuff. But I just find like at the students that I've encountered, um, both a very anxious generation, and understandably so, but also hearteningly really romantic, full of ardor and idealism and earnestness and good things, I think. Yeah. But one of the things that is sort of coming up for my students is this difficulty closing the gap, right, between the ideal that they encounter in literature and the fantasies it therefore generates, and I guess just the sordidness of reality, and romantic reality also. So that's something that's come up in my meetings a lot. So I guess I wanted to ask you, because you suggested at some point that one of the things that reading opens up is an ability to sort of make peace with or even play with an absence of fixed meaning. And therefore, I think you said a certain fantasy of sexual relation. All of this is a long-winded way of asking what is the relationship that you are suggesting can exist between reading and fantasy?
I mean, fantasy comes in at the place at which there is no meaning. I mean, fantasy in a way is a defense against the lack in meaning, and at least a certain Lacanian sort of diction. So there's a way in which I think reading, the act of reading that I'm interested in, that I think really helps. And I'm similarly, I go into my classrooms and I'm teaching these psychoanalysis and literature classes, and inevitably at least 3 students by the end of the semester are asking for a referral to a psychoanalyst. And they're, and so my friends are, all my colleagues, they write me every semester. They were like, so so, and they, and the student, because they're really coming in with a desire, and you're right, it's an incredibly anxious generation, really struggling. This is the pandemic generation. But I'm actually seeing, I don't know if you all have had the same experience, but it's actually been this year that, I did find that there was a real lag in reading ability and commitment to reading for a few years. And then this year it's actually changed. And it occurred to me that it might be the students who really were in high school during the pandemic who were really struggling more, and that now we're maybe a little bit out of it. But they're coming in with a real, not having necessarily been well prepared for this kind of work, but with a real commitment to trying to figure themselves out and figure out how to live, and a question about how reading and texts can help with that, and also what writing will do. So, part of what I do in almost all of my classes is I ask them to write both academically and personally. I ask them to write actually auto theory, and I work on auto theory, and I think that the intervention of auto theory, it's really kind of hystericizing the academy in a way that's very, very important, and that I want to participate in. But part of my premise is like, your aim here in reading and writing is to figure out how to live. And these are commensurate activities, that it is by learning how to read, learning how to think, learning how to write, that you can find a way to author yourself into your life. That means in part shifting the frame of the fantasy in a way. So, I don't know that I'm interested in fantasy as like a plot device so much as I am in like widen in sort of like encouraging a kind of fluency with the void in meaning, where fantasy will inevitably come in, and then see what can shift in one's fantasy as a result.
I just as a quick aside, I remember 2 years ago when I having these conversations with friends and colleagues about the students' difficulty to not just actually entertain fantasy, but even like engage with the fantasy work of a fictional character. And being like, well, because like, and the questions of like consent and being like what I felt like it was a lot of reticence about just even engaging in like having a fantasy life about a real person, because that felt to the students kind of like a violation, which is quite interesting because it was about like, I don't know, anyway, I don't even know really how to take it, but it's been kind of like difficult teaching sometimes sexual difference or even fantasy because of the kind of like an absence of vocabulary that we may have taken for granted, but somehow there's a gap. In any case, which I would love to talk more about. But I have a question for Dora, which I was wondering how we were talking about yesterday and another time about the slippage, the genre coincidence that you were talking about yesterday between theory and novel, and a lot of like the theory novel, especially as it is practiced by the ethnic writer. And as you were talking, I thought, is there a way of reading that genre slippage as itself wanting to authorize a certain like a indulgence in typification as a way of being like what I am aware, like it's a way of the kind of an armoring of a this kinds of theories that made kind of hindered or kind of made impeded the access to typification because of its how dangerous it is to stereotype or like all the hard-won battles of the 60s and the 70s championed by ethnic studies, etc. And I wonder if the theory novel of the ethnic writer is a way of being like, I got it, and I can now engage in type and its utopic potential. Like, I'm just kind of thinking, like, is there a different way of reading the theory in the novel as a way of circumventing the bind, right? As a way of being like, I have done my homework, and I'm because I have done my homework, I can now explore the potentials of type because I have, and this way of like signaling that I understand the perils of type.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, we would have to look at the individual cases, right, and of what we mean by the theory novel. But I do find myself coming back to the question of genre a lot. And, I think in general, like my question is, I'm really drawn to the way to what Lukács thinks the realist novel can do, right? And it's for him, it's just the high bourgeois European novel of this, it's like this much. And so, I think my question is like, well, so where, like, what does a proper critical social realism look like in the present? And it probably won't look like Balzac anymore. And, it certainly won't if you take seriously that the novel kind of is proper to its age and is informed by kind of its particular historical conditions. So it may well be that the theory novel, I don't know. So I don't know if the theory novel like is a way out of that bind, or if it just kind of ends up being a kind of defense, actually, or a sort of like, you described as a kind of armoring, like it's a kind of self-conscious, I know I'm going to be read this way, and I think this is like the problem in a different way with those satires of publishing that I'm describing, right? Like one of the responses, the turn is to use something like satire, and the theory novel could be like a certain kind of self-consciousness. It's really the self-consciousness, right? But like, how do you, is that a kind of sufficient does that give you like enough escape velocity? I'm not sure. But that's something I'll have to think about. So thanks for proposing that.
Thank you all. My question is for Liesel, and it's about questions of translation as reading that pick up on some of the discussion we were having with Cheryl yesterday. And this is a particular example. I'm thinking of just about translation as a practice of writing a text that is kind of creatively rewriting it. And I was struck when I was looking at your slides by one line of the Verlaine that translates aujourd'hui as nowadays and puts it at the end of the line, which seems quite an active recomposing of the text. In order to preserve the rhyme, it seems, and in so doing, to in some ways really quite change it. Obviously, as someone working in two languages, you confront this all the time in a way that those of us who work predominantly in a single language don't. And I'm wondering just how that bears on the question of the activity of close reading.
Thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, that particular translation, you diagnosed correctly that is Kevin Kirschway, who has put centuries with nowadays in order to preserve some kind of approximate rhyme there. And in terms of
What moves it and also changes
it's huge.
Angle translation. I mean, it's like it's not exactly perfect to say it reads nowadays.
Indeed, indeed. The semantic slippage is vast.
Yeah.
But here, I would actually defend Kirschway in that semantic precision has never been Verlaine's calling card, as it were, right? And so the preservation of the distique, like the couplets in that poem is extremely important because it's also inscribing it in Rousseau's definition of the romance, which is evoked all throughout the poem. And so it's also part of this rendering equivalent of the poem with the popular song. And so I'm fairly confident in saying that Verlaine could care less about the aujourd'hui in a way, and the rhyme would actually be more important for him. But anyway, we're in the dicey ground of every translation is a reading, right? Yeah. And so you're guessing about the intent of the author, or the hierarchy of linguistic information. And of course, as a brave outsider to the language, especially in the Anglophone world, we tend to privilege aspects that are visible or readily perceptible that are not necessarily meaning laden in the translation, right? So word order varies in different languages, and so changing the order of the words is not necessarily a big change, right? That might be more semantically precise in many translations. In this particular case, probably not. You are right, but the things that we grab onto, right? The false friends and the cognates and the word order, those aren't necessarily big changes, even in a semantic realm, let alone on the level of the sound structure of the language. And just maybe an anecdote about the close reading and quotation, just in relation to your interesting quotation. I find it fascinating that as someone who I'm from comparative literature, work in French, when I publish in French studies, the editors go nuts because I quote translated bits of French, and they take them all out. No, you can't quote that because it's not the text. If it's in the quotes, it has to be the French. Whereas it's standard practice in many Anglophone journals, if you go to New Literary History, that you quote the translation as if it's the text. And so the slippage between translating and the critical practice that sort of sparks in me, when is the translation criticism, where is that line, is it's thrown into sharp relief by those two publishing outlets, but it's very unclear.
Just to follow up quickly, there's a way your answer is defending the translation of the two, even without the recourse to the song structure. seem to kind of replay in miniature much of what Dora was talking about too. And insofar as you went from this very particular question of translating a single line to, well, there's this like large kind of romance or ballad structure, which would actually like make it sound right, which is a move at the kind of hermeneutic, it's a kind of hermeneutic circle version of what Dora was talking about. It's moving from the particular to the general and back and keeping them in this kind of interpretive.
It's true. It's true. And the vehicle for that is the dictionary.
Yeah.
Basically, right? That it's like we can move from the particular to the general because we have Rousseau's like Disney de la musique, which gives the structure that clearly Verlaine is evoking like through many references. Anyway, maybe that is actually interesting. The dictionary is that intervening space.
Do you want a last question before we leave the room?
Thank you so much. This was extremely stimulating, and I had a question for both Emma and Dora. And I was put in mind of this, especially because, Emma, you raised the sort of debate that Helen Andrews's article set off. And so I was thinking about pervasive cultural forms of reading outside of course, literature and the academy that have to do with reading for evidence, reading particular things as evidence selectively, and questions of scale, like this form of reading as a way of getting around absence of real world experience with particulars in one's lives, as well as getting purchase on questions of differentiation, both in gender and sexuality and in race. And I'm thinking in particular of this very, now I think culturally pervasive move of adducing anything from journalism to case studies to autofiction, which are all operating at very different scales in order to assert or reinforce or bump up or negotiate questions of experience and difference. And this is super pervasive online. So I was wondering how the forms of reading and the materials that you teach should be in dialogue with this kind of lay but extremely significant kind of reading that is taking place outside of our classrooms and conversations, whether they should be they can serve as a corrective, or in some way maybe mediate those kinds of reading that is happening elsewhere and that is very much informing the way that people are then approaching texts and people and communities.
I could start. Thanks for that question. I think it's because I've just been teaching Kathy Gallagher's The Rise of Fictionality and I think actually it's really there, the importance of the specifically fictional is really there also in Zadie Smith's essay. It's kind of making me see it in a new way that, for what Smith argues is kind of elided in this kind of imperative of biographical correspondence is the category of fiction as something distinct, right? So for Gallagher, in this argument, she is tracing the emergence of the fictional as a category as distinct from both truth and deception. And so this is that your question about sort of reading, newspapers or journalism, kind of personal opinion essays, social media posts, and also literary representations as kind of interchangeable, especially in addressing questions of experience. I think I totally see also in, I think my students, but also just more generally, I think in the culture. And I don't know if I'm just constantly returning to genre for some reason, but like it may be important. I think to me, it's less a question of like specifically the method of reading, but what the specific conventions, what the generic conventions are, right, of different kinds of writing, and to understand, the tweet and the clickbait piece or the think piece and the novel as something kind of distinct. I know that that's being blurred by things like auto theory and auto fiction, and I do find myself kind of actually being interested in kind of having a certain resistance to the resistance to categorization and genre boundaries. So I think something can also be lost there as well. So yeah,
You know, I'm interested in what works for students, and what they need. And to my mind, they need to read. And to a certain extent, I don't actually care what the material is. So I just had, in one of my undergraduate classes, we had a really fantastic conversation about we were doing Foucault, and it turned to surveillance and social media. And they really needed to talk about their experience of social media and to read it with a critical eye. That's fine by me. That's a great class as far as I'm concerned. So I don't want, and there's a way I think in which I do want them to listen to the action of the signifier in any text, because the signifier is going to work, and you can't listen in quite that way to any tweet, but it will make its presence known in some tweets. And certainly Trump, for example, who makes lots of slips, gives us plenty of fodder for this kind of listening. So that, I think, justifies a kind of cross-generic form of reading or form of listening that I just want my students to be, I want it to be available to my students, whether or not they're using it at every moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We'll reconvene at 1 for our final panel about AI and artificial intelligence and all that comes with it.